The red and blue lights cut through the absolute black of a mid-August night like knives through velvet. On an empty stretch of rural highway, those lights meant only one thing to most drivers: trouble. For David Henderson, the sudden explosion of color in his rearview mirror was worse than a simple traffic stop. It was a calculated ambush. The officer swaggering toward his window did not care about speed limits or broken taillights. He saw a black man behind the wheel of a car he believed no one who looked like David had any right to own. What that smug deputy failed to understand was that he had just stopped the single worst possible target in the entire state of Virginia. His career was about to end in a public, irreversible humiliation inside the idling patrol cruiser. The air hung thick with the stale smell of burnt coffee, cheap spearmint gum, and the heavy humidity that always settled over the pine forests after midnight. Officer Bradley Jenkins leaned back in the driver's seat, boots propped on the dashboard like a man who owned the road. 15 years with the Buckingham County Sheriff's Office had taught him that the badge was less a symbol of service and more a personal crown. Beside him sat Officer Toby Lawson, 6 months out of the academy, uniform still creased, posture rigid with the desperate need to belong. State Route 20 ran through the dense pine country of Buckingham County, a lonely ribbon of asphalt roughly an hour southwest of Richmond. After midnight, the road became a dead zone, exactly the kind of place Jenkins preferred. Less paperwork, more opportunity. He tapped thick fingers against the steering wheel and stared into the darkness. "Dead as a graveyard out here, Lawson," he muttered, rolling down the window to spit into the night. "I need some action, a drunk, a speeder, anything to keep me from driving us into a ditch." Lawson kept his eyes on the laptop mounted between the seats. "Dispatch says it's quiet across the board, sir. We could just run radar by the overpass for a while." Jenkins let out a harsh, grating laugh. "Radar is for meter maids. We're out here to police. You have to hunt, kid. You look for the things that don't belong." Just then, a pair of crisp LED headlights crested the low hill ahead. The vehicle held a steady, legal 65 in the right lane. As it passed their hidden pull-off, the sodium streetlights briefly washed over a brand-new charcoal-gray Audi A8, sleek, immaculate, and completely out of place on a blue-collar stretch of rural Virginia highway. It wasn't the car that made Jenkins sit up. It was the brief flash of the driver. A black man in a sharp navy suit, relaxed behind the wheel of a 6-figure luxury sedan. Jenkins's lips curled into a slow, predatory smirk. He dropped his boots to the floorboard and shoved the cruiser into drive. "Well, well," he murmured. "Looks like the circus came to town. What do you figure a guy like that is doing in a rig like that at 1:17 in the morning?" Lawson frowned at the receding taillights. "I don't know. He wasn't speeding. Tags looked current. Maybe he's just passing through." "Passing through," Jenkins repeated, mocking the words. He flipped on the headlights and accelerated hard. "A man who looks like that, in a car like that, in my county, is either running product, driving something stolen, or lost as hell. Either way, we're going to have a little talk. Consider this a training exercise, rookie." "Sir, we don't have probable cause," Lawson said, voice already thinning. He knew Jenkins's reputation, the long list of excessive force complaints and racial profiling accusations that somehow always vanished under the protective wing of the local union. "Probable cause," Jenkins laughed, cold and empty. "Watch his left rear tire. He drifted. Looked like a lane violation to me." "He didn't drift, sir. He's dead center in the lane." "I said he drifted, Lawson." The tone left no room for argument. "Hit the lights. Let's have some fun." A mile ahead, David Henderson glanced at the rearview mirror as the cruiser closed the gap. At 42, he carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent a decade becoming one of the sharpest legal minds in the Commonwealth before leaving private practice to serve the public. He was exhausted. 14 hours of grinding budget negotiations at a private retreat 3 counties west had left him wanting nothing more than the short drive home to his wife and daughter in Richmond. When the red and blue lights detonated behind him, painting the Audi's interior in harsh strobes, David let out a long, measured breath. Speedometer sat exactly on the limit. No warning lights on the dash. He knew exactly what this was. It was not the first time he had been stopped for the crime of existing in a space someone else decided he did not belong. With deliberate calm, he signaled, slowed, and pulled onto the wide gravel shoulder. He shifted into park, killed the engine, and rolled down all 4 windows. A habit learned years earlier, so every interior surface stayed visible. He switched on the dome light and placed both hands at 12 o'clock on the steering wheel. In the cup holder, his phone glowed, Bluetooth still connected to the car's audio system. An active call timer read 45 minutes and 12 seconds. "Did you hear that, Robert?" he asked quietly into the cabin. A deep, gravelly voice answered through the hidden speakers. "I heard the siren, David. Are you getting pulled over?" "Looks that way. Buckingham County Sheriff's Office. I'm on Route 20 just past mile marker 42. Stay on the line. Mute your end. I want a witness." "You've got one." The soft chime of the muted microphone was the only reply. David watched the heavy-set officer approach with a flashlight already raised, playing his part in a script David knew by heart. The crunch of boots on gravel was loud in the still night. Jenkins took his time, dragging the maglite beam along the Audi's flawless bodywork, then slapped a greasy palm hard against the trunk to check it was closed. Behind him, Lawson hung back near the rear bumper, clearly uncomfortable. Jenkins stopped just behind the driver's pillar, forcing David to twist awkwardly to look up at him. Without a word, he clicked the maglite to its highest setting and drove the beam straight into David's eyes. David blinked once, hands never leaving the wheel. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Jenkins leaned in until his face was inches from the window frame and took a long, deliberate sniff of the interior, hunting for marijuana or alcohol. All he found was expensive leather and a faint trace of peppermint. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," he demanded, voice stripped of any professional courtesy. The light stayed locked on David's face. "Absolutely." David's tone stayed level. "Wallet's in my inner left jacket pocket. Registration and insurance are in the glove box. I'm going to reach for the wallet first. Is that all right?" Jenkins smirked behind the glare. He loved it when they already knew the dance. "Make it slow, buddy. I get nervous when people move fast in the dark." David removed his left hand, unbuttoned the jacket, withdrew the leather wallet, and passed the license through the window. He leaned across, opened the glove box, and handed over the slim black folder containing the vehicle documents. Jenkins snatched the papers. He lowered the light just enough to read. "David Henderson." He glanced from the card to the man in the suit, a sneer already forming. "David Henderson. Nice suit. Nice car, too. Audi A8. What does a thing like this run? 90? 100 grand?" "Something like that," David answered evenly. "Officer, could you tell me why I was pulled over?" "I'm asking the questions here, buddy." The light slammed back into David's eyes. "I asked you a question. Whose car is this?" "It's my car. The registration is right there." "Registration can be faked." Jenkins leaned a thick forearm against the roof. "You don't look like the kind of guy who can afford a $100,000 car, David. What line of work you in? You dealing something you shouldn't be? Moving weight up the interstate?" Behind the trunk, Lawson visibly winced. "Officer Jenkins." "Quiet, Lawson." Jenkins never looked back. "Well, I asked you a question, boy. What do you do for a living?" The word boy landed like a spark on dry tinder. David felt the familiar heat rise in his chest and crushed it instantly. He knew the game, provoke the reaction, then weaponize the anger as resistance. He would not give Jenkins the satisfaction. "I work for the Commonwealth," he said, voice perfectly modulated, empty of heat. Jenkins barked a loud, ugly laugh that bounced off the pines. "The Commonwealth? What, you work down at the DMV? Sweep floors at the Capitol? Must be one hell of a union to afford a car like this." "I am an advisor," David said simply. "Now, officer, I have complied with every request. I have provided identification. For the second time, I'm asking you to articulate the reasonable suspicion that justified this stop. Was I speeding?" The polite legal language only irritated Jenkins further. He hated when they thought they were smart. "You drifted over the yellow line about a mile back, swerving. Indicator of driving under the influence." "I see. I'm quite certain I maintained my lane. Do you have dash cam footage of this alleged swerve?" Listen to me, you arrogant son of a—" Jenkins hissed, dropping every pretense. He unclipped the safety strap on his holster and rested his hand on the grip of his service weapon. The threat was quiet and unmistakable. "You don't interrogate me. You're in my county. I say you swerved, you swerved. Matter of fact, your eyes look a little glassy. You've been drinking, smoking something?" "I have had nothing to drink, and I do not use narcotics." David's gaze flicked once to the phone in the console. The timer still ran, 48:22. The man on the other end of the line was hearing every word. "Step out of the vehicle," Jenkins ordered, taking a half step back into a tactical stance. "Officer," David said, voice dropping an octave that finally made the rookie Lawson look up. "I do not believe a field sobriety test is warranted. I am not under the influence. I would like the citation for the lane violation if you intend to write one so I can be on my way." "I said step out of the damn car," Jenkins roared. He grabbed the door handle and yanked. The door was locked. He pounded a heavy fist against the reinforced glass. "Unlock this door right now and step out, or I will bust this window, drag you out by those expensive lapels, and arrest you for disobeying a lawful order and resisting. Do you understand me?" "Officer Jenkins," Lawson stepped forward, voice cracking. "Maybe we should just run his license and let him go. He's not doing anything." "Back the hell off, Lawson." Jenkins's face mottled red. He drew his taser and put the bright red laser sight on David's chest through the glass. 10 seconds, David. Unlock the door." Inside the car, David remained perfectly still. He did not reach for the lock. He did not raise his hands in panic. He simply looked at the officer with a mixture of pity and cold disgust. "Officer Jenkins," he said, voice cutting through the night like a scalpel. "Before you do something that will permanently ruin your life, you should know I am currently on the phone." Jenkins sneered and pressed the taser closer to the glass. "I don't give a damn if you're on the phone with your mama, your lawyer, or Jesus Christ himself. 5 seconds. "I am on the phone with the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia," David said softly. For a split second, the sheer absurdity of the claim short-circuited Jenkins's rage. Then he burst into malicious laughter. "The governor? Oh, that's rich. That's the best one I've heard all year. You're pathetic." David did not blink. He calmly reached toward the center console. "Hands where I can see them," Jenkins yelled. David ignored him, tapped the phone screen, took the call off mute, and turned the Audi's premium audio system to maximum volume. 5 miles back on the same highway, Governor Robert Callahan sat in the plush leather captain's chair of an armored Chevrolet Suburban, seething. At 57, he was a broad-shouldered, relentless man, known for a volcanic temper when provoked and absolute zero tolerance for corruption. He and David Henderson had been close friends for 15 years. 3 weeks earlier, Callahan had appointed David his chief of staff, the highest-ranking unelected official in the state government. They had spent the entire evening mapping a sweeping criminal justice reform bill and taken separate cars back to Richmond only because the governor needed a quick press stop. For the last 5 minutes, the governor of Virginia had listened in stunned, growing horror as one of his own sworn officers racially profiled, threatened, and verbally abused his best friend and chief of staff. "David, is the speaker on?" Callahan's voice thundered through the Audi's surround sound system with enough bass to vibrate the windows. Outside, Jenkins flinched. The taser wavered. He stared at the dashboard, then at David, confusion beginning to crack the aggression on his face. "It's on, Robert," David said calmly. "Who the hell is this?" Jenkins demanded, trying to reclaim authority. A tremor of uncertainty had already entered his voice. "This is a police investigation. You're interfering." "This is Governor Robert Callahan," the voice boomed into the humid night. "And you, officer, are about to have the worst night of your miserable existence. What is your badge number?" Jenkins forced a scoff, even as color drained from his face. "Nice try, pal. You think I'm stupid? You got some buddy of yours playing pretend on the phone. Get out of the car, David, right now. I'm calling for backup." "Officer Jenkins, isn't it?" Callahan's voice cut back, cold and lethal. "I heard your rookie partner call you by name. Let me make this crystal clear. You are illegally detaining my chief of staff. You have fabricated probable cause. You have used racially abusive language. and you have threatened a senior state official with a weapon. I have recorded every second of this interaction. Near the rear of the Audi, Lawson went completely pale. His knees actually buckled. "Oh my God," he whispered. "He's telling the truth. That voice, that's the governor." Jenkins whipped around. "Shut up! It's a trick!" He turned back to the window and raised the taser again, desperate to regain control. "I don't care what kind of prank you're pulling. You're under arrest." Inside the Suburban, Callahan no longer bothered raising his voice. The time for talk was finished. He met the eyes of his driver in the rear-view mirror, a hardened Virginia State Police sergeant named Elias Miller. "Sergeant," Callahan said quietly, "activate the emergency lights. Push this vehicle to its absolute limit. My chief of staff is being held at gunpoint by a rogue deputy 5 miles up this road. We are going to collect him." "Yes, sir." Miller flipped a switch. Instantly, the grille, windshield, and mirrors of the massive black Suburban erupted in a blinding array of red and blue strobes. The deafening wail of the state police sirens shattered the quiet. Behind them, 2 more identical armored SUVs lit up in unison. "Hold on, Governor." The 3-ton vehicle surged forward, V8 roaring as the driver buried the accelerator. The convoy tore down Route 20, a high-speed wall of flashing lights and authority, cutting through the darkness and closing the 5-mile gap at terrifying speed. Back at the stop, David sat motionless, listening to the sirens through the phone speakers synchronized with the faint, growing wail now echoing through the trees behind them. Jenkins heard it too. He froze, taser still pointed at the glass. He stared down the long, straight stretch of highway behind his cruiser. At first there was nothing. Then a faint glow appeared on the horizon, red and blue, moving impossibly fast. "You called for backup," Jenkins yelled at Lawson, panic finally punching through the arrogance. "No, sir." Lawson stumbled backward from the Audi. "I never touched the radio." "Governor," David said into the quiet cabin, "how far out are you?" 60 seconds, David," Callahan answered, engine roar audible behind his voice. "Keep your hands on the wheel. Do not give this thug a reason to pull that trigger." Jenkins stared at the phone, then at David. The absolute, unshakable calm in David's eyes finally pierced the last of the deputy's ego. The reality crashed down like a physical weight. The voice on the phone was no prank. The sirens tearing toward them were not local backup. "Oh," Jenkins breathed, lowering the taser. His hands began to shake. You're really—" "I told you," David said softly, looking up at the terrified man. "I work for the Commonwealth." The glow on the horizon became a glare. The low roar of heavy engines became thunder. Jenkins stumbled backward toward his own cruiser, mind scrambling for an exit, a lie, any narrative that might save him. He was out of time. 3 massive, unmarked black Suburbans crested the hill at more than 90 miles an hour. They did not slow to form a neat line behind the local cruiser. They swarmed the scene like a military strike package. The lead SUV slammed its brakes and skidded across the gravel, deliberately boxing in Jenkins's patrol car and cutting off any escape. The second vehicle pulled aggressively alongside the Audi, shielding it. The third parked diagonally across both lanes, shutting the highway down completely. Doors burst open before the vehicles had fully settled. 6 heavily armed Virginia State Police troopers, the governor's elite personal security detail, poured into the night in full tactical gear, faces grim and professional. "State Police, drop the weapon!" the lead trooper bellowed, sidearm already trained on Jenkins. "Drop it now, hands in the air!" Jenkins, thoroughly panicked, dropped the taser onto the asphalt as if it had burned him. He threw his hands up, chest heaving. Wait, I'm an officer, Buckingham County Sheriff's Office. We're on the same side." "On your knees, now!" the trooper roared, advancing with terrifying speed. Beside the cruiser, Rookie Lawson had already dropped to his knees voluntarily, hands clasped behind his head, sobbing quietly in pure terror. Then the rear door of the lead Suburban swung open. Governor Robert Callahan stepped out into the humid night. Jacket gone, tie loosened, jaw set in a line of absolute, uncompromising fury. He looked less like a politician and more like an executioner. He ignored the troopers. He ignored Lawson. He walked straight through the strobing lights, eyes locked on Bradley Jenkins, who now knelt trembling on the gravel. The governor had arrived. Hell had come with him. The air was almost still except for the rhythmic clicking of cooling engines and the harsh electronic pulse of the emergency lights. Red and blue washed the towering pines, turning the desolate stretch of Route 20 into a brightly lit theater of reckoning. Callahan walked toward the kneeling deputy without hurry. Every step carried the full weight of the office and of personal outrage. "Governor," Jenkins' voice cracked into a high-pitched whine. Sweat poured down his flushed face. "Governor Callahan, sir, there's been a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding. I was conducting a routine—" Silence. The single word left Callahan's mouth not as a shout, but as a low, devastating command that seemed to silence the entire forest. Jenkins's jaw snapped shut so hard his teeth clicked. Callahan stopped 2 feet in front of the kneeling man and looked down with pure disgust. "I have been on the phone with my chief of staff for the past 48 minutes, officer. I heard you manufacture probable cause. I heard you threaten him with physical violence. I heard you aim a weapon at an unarmed citizen who had fully complied with every one of your legally dubious demands." "He was swerving," Jenkins blurted, desperation overriding survival instinct. "I swear to God, sir, he crossed the yellow line. I smelled something in the car. I have to protect this county." At that moment, the heavy door of the Audi A8 clicked open. David Henderson stepped out into the humid night, smoothed the lapels of his tailored navy suit, and looked as immaculate as if he had just left a boardroom rather than a roadside ambush. He walked around the front of the car, phone still in hand, expression calm and stoic. "Good evening, Robert," he said quietly, stepping up beside the governor. Callahan's hard expression softened a fraction as he looked at his oldest friend. "Are you all right, David?" "I'm fine, just a bit delayed getting home." Jenkins stared at the man he had called boy, the man he had intended to drag from the car by the collar to stroke his own fragile ego. Now standing shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful executive in the Commonwealth. The sickening scale of his catastrophic mistake finally settled into his stomach like lead. Before he could invent another excuse, a new siren wailed out of the darkness. A sleek, white Buckingham County Sheriff's SUV came barreling down the opposite lane, light bar blazing. It slammed to a halt just past the state police roadblock, tires screaming. Sheriff Thomas Harding, 30-year veteran, silver-haired, heavy star pinned to his chest, shoved the door open and marched into the chaos. He had been listening to the scanner from home when the sudden explosion of state police traffic on a local channel dragged him out of bed. "What in the hell is going on here?" Harding bellowed, hand resting on his duty belt as he took in the sight of his veteran deputy on his knees surrounded by tactical troopers. His eyes locked on the governor, and his anger faltered into shock. "Governor Callahan, what are your people doing in my county? This is my jurisdiction." Callahan turned slowly. The usual political courtesy was gone. "Your jurisdiction, Thomas, is a disgrace," he said flatly, voice carrying clearly over the idling engines. "Your jurisdiction just attempted to unlawfully detain, assault, and possibly frame the chief of staff of this Commonwealth." Harding blinked, looking from Callahan to David and finally down at Jenkins. "Bradley, what is he talking about?" Jenkins saw a lifeline and looked up at his boss with manufactured terror. "Sheriff, thank God, they ambushed me. I pulled this guy over on suspicion of DUI, and the next thing I know, state police are aiming rifles at me. They're stepping all over our authority." Harding's posture stiffened. The thin blue line instinct flared. He turned back to the governor, jaw set. "With all due respect, Governor, my men have a job to do. If Deputy Jenkins suspected a DUI, he had every right to initiate a stop. You can't just send your personal army to intimidate my officers because your friend got a ticket." David stepped forward and held up the smartphone. He tapped the screen. "I don't give a damn if you're on the phone with your mama, your lawyer, or Jesus Christ himself." 5 seconds. Jenkins's recorded voice blasted through the phone speaker, thick with violent aggression. David tapped again. "You don't look like the kind of guy who can afford a $100,000 car, David. You dealing something you shouldn't be? Moving weight up the interstate?" Sheriff Harding's face drained of color as the undeniable audio evidence filled the open air. The casual, blatant racism and thuggish intimidation of his own deputy were laid bare for everyone present. "I have the entire 48-minute interaction recorded, Sheriff Harding," David said, voice cold and precise, including the moment he claimed I was swerving, despite my dash cam and lane assist telemetry proving I maintained perfect center. Including the moment he aimed a taser at my chest while I was seatbelted, hands fully visible, simply asking for his reasonable suspicion. Callahan stepped closer to the sheriff, invading his personal space. "So, Thomas, do you still want to defend him? Do you want to stand before the press tomorrow and tell the entire Commonwealth that this rogue predator represents the values of the Buckingham County Sheriff's Office?" Harding looked down at Jenkins. The veteran deputy was no longer looking at his boss. His eyes were glued to the gravel, shoulders shaking. "No, sir," Harding whispered. The fight had left him completely. "Good," Callahan said, voice snapping like a whip. He pointed a rigid finger at Jenkins, who flinched as if struck. "Bradley Jenkins, as the chief executive of this Commonwealth and in direct coordination with your commanding officer, you are hereby relieved of your duties effective immediately." "You can't do that," Jenkins shrieked, panic overriding logic. "The Union! I have rights! You can't fire me on the side of a highway!" "Watch me," Callahan growled. He turned to Harding. "Thomas, I want his badge. I want his service weapon. I want his taser. And I want him stripped of his credentials right now, or I will have the Attorney General place your entire department under state investigation by sunrise." Harding did not hesitate. He unclipped a set of heavy steel cuffs from his belt and walked toward Jenkins. "Stand up, Bradley." His voice was thick with profound disappointment and deep-seated anger. He had covered for Jenkins' aggressive policing in the past, telling himself it was simply old-school police work. He now realized he had been harboring a monster. Jenkins slowly rose, trembling violently. Harding expertly disarmed him, handing the Glock, the taser, and the extra magazines to State Police Sergeant Elias Miller, who had stepped forward to assist. Then Harding grabbed the silver star pinned to Jenkins's chest and ripped it free, taking a piece of the uniform fabric with it. "Hands behind your back." "Sheriff, please!" Jenkins begged, tears finally spilling. "It was just a mistake. I was just trying to do my job. It was a joke, just for fun, to scare him a little." The words hung in the humid air, toxic and vile. David's jaw tightened. "Subjecting a citizen to terror under color of law is not a game, Mr. Jenkins. It is a felony." As Harding locked the cuffs tightly around Jenkins's wrists, Callahan turned to Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant, ensure the following charges are processed through the state system, bypassing the county commonwealth's attorney entirely. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon for aiming the taser at an unarmed, non-threatening citizen, deprivation of rights under color of law, a severe federal civil rights violation, falsifying an official police report and probable cause for fabricating the traffic violation, and unlawful detention for holding David Henderson without legal merit." "Wait!" The sudden shout came from the darkness near the rear of the patrol cruiser. Everyone turned. Rookie Officer Toby Lawson stood up. His pristine uniform was covered in dust from kneeling on the gravel. His face was still pale, but his eyes held a sudden, desperate resolve. "Lawson, keep your mouth shut," Jenkins hissed over his shoulder. "No." Lawson's voice trembled but grew louder. He stepped out of the shadow of the cruiser and walked directly toward Sheriff Harding and the governor. "I won't cover for you anymore. I can't do it." He looked straight at Callahan. "Sir, Governor, it wasn't a mistake. He does this all the time." A heavy silence fell over the highway. Even the crickets in the surrounding pines seemed to stop. "Explain, Officer Lawson," Callahan commanded, eyes narrowing. "He calls it hunting," Lawson confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and relief. "He sits on this stretch of highway specifically looking for minorities driving nice cars or out-of-state plates. He brags about it. He keeps a tally in his locker back at the precinct of how many high rollers he can terrorize in a month. He told me tonight was a training exercise, to show me how to put people in their place." Sheriff Harding looked as though he had been punched in the stomach. "A tally, Toby? Are you telling me the truth?" "Yes, Sheriff." Tears welled in Lawson's eyes. I've been terrified to say anything. He told me if I ratted him out, the union would blackball me and he'd make sure I never worked in this state again. But I didn't become a cop to do this." He gestured vaguely toward the humiliated, sobbing Jenkins. Callahan exchanged a dark look with David. The situation had just escalated from a single incident of racial profiling to a systemic, premeditated hunting game operating under the protection of a taxpayer-funded badge. "Sergeant Miller," Callahan said, voice deadly quiet. "Yes, Governor. Put Mr. Jenkins in the back of my vehicle. He is not going to the county jail. He is going straight to the state penitentiary holding facility. I want him in a maximum security cell by 3 o'clock this morning." "Yes, sir." Miller grabbed Jenkins roughly by the bicep, ignoring the disgraced officer's pathetic sobbing, and hauled him toward the armored Suburban. Callahan then turned his piercing gaze on Sheriff Harding. The local lawman suddenly looked older, smaller, crushed under the weight of his department's failure. "Thomas," Callahan said, "you are going to secure that precinct locker tonight. You will personally hand over this tally to the Virginia State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And tomorrow morning you and I are going to have a very long, very painful meeting about the future of your career and the funding of your department. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, Governor," Harding replied hollowly. He looked over at David. "Mr. Henderson, I am profoundly sorry. For what it's worth." David studied the sheriff for a long moment. He offered no polite absolution. He simply nodded once. "We will see what your apology is worth when the state audits your department's traffic stops for the last 5 years, Sheriff." He turned away from the local officers and walked back toward his Audi. The familiar heavy exhaustion settled into his bones again, but this time it was mixed with a cold, sharp satisfaction. He had survived the encounter, a privilege denied to far too many who looked like him. Tonight the predator had been caught in his own trap, and the consequences were going to echo across the entire Commonwealth. The sun had barely broken over the horizon when Richmond awoke to a political earthquake. Before the morning news anchors had poured their first cups of coffee, 20 heavily armed agents from the Virginia State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation descended on the Buckingham County Sheriff's Precinct. They did not knock. They walked through the glass double doors with state warrants in hand, effectively occupying the building and freezing all local operations. Sheriff Thomas Harding stood in the corner of his own bullpen, looking a decade older than he had the night before. He watched in stunned silence as agents systematically confiscated hard drives, body cam servers, and filing cabinets. The true devastation, however, waited in the basement locker room. 2 BCI agents, accompanied by a very nervous Toby Lawson, approached locker number 42, Bradley Jenkins's locker. Armed with bolt cutters, they snapped the heavy brass padlock and pulled the metal door open. What they found inside transformed a civil rights violation into a sprawling criminal conspiracy. Lawson had told the governor about a tally, a boastful scoreboard of minorities and out-of-towners Jenkins had terrorized. The notebook resting on the top shelf was no simple tally. It was a meticulously kept handwritten ledger. When the lead agent opened the leather-bound book, his jaw tightened. The pages were not merely lists of names and races. They were lists of assets, cash amounts, Rolex watches, designer luggage, and vehicle impound fees. Jenkins had not simply been pulling people over for a sadistic power trip. He had been operating a highly lucrative illegal highway robbery syndicate under the legal cover of civil asset forfeiture. The scheme was chillingly simple and exploited a dark loophole in the system. Jenkins and a select group of rogue deputies would profile wealthy-looking minorities or drivers with out-of-state plates, pull them over, and manufacture probable cause for a drug search. Once they tore the car apart, they would find cash. Sometimes thousands of dollars people were carrying for legitimate travel or business. Jenkins would falsely claim the money was suspected drug proceeds and seize it on the spot. Then he would offer the terrified drivers a sinister ultimatum: keep the cash and walk away with a warning, or fight it, get arrested for felony trafficking, lose the luxury car to tow, and spend the next 3 years battling it out in a rural county court system stacked against them. Most people, terrified of a racist and rigged process, simply walked away and left their hard-earned money behind. But the ledger revealed something worse. Jenkins was not a criminal mastermind smart enough to launder that kind of money alone. Beside every seized amount was a percentage split. 30% went to Jenkins. A massive 50% was funneled to the initials CW. Captain Wallace, Sheriff Harding whispered, staring at the photocopied page an agent shoved into his hands. Wallace was Harding's second in command, the man responsible for auditing the department's evidence locker and forfeiture accounts. Before the clock struck 9 that morning, Captain Wallace was arrested at his desk while frantically trying to shred bank statements linking him to offshore shell companies. By noon, the story had exploded across every major national news network. The headlines were relentless. Governor ambushes corrupt cop in highway showdown, and Chief of Staff exposes multi-million-dollar police extortion ring. David Henderson sat in his spacious office adjacent to the governor's suite, watching the muted coverage on a flat-screen television. His phone had been ringing non-stop for 6 hours. Senators, civil rights leaders, and national talk show hosts all wanted interviews. He ignored every call. Governor Callahan walked in, suit jacket discarded, looking exhausted but fiercely vindicated. He dropped a thick manila folder onto David's desk. BCI just seized $2 million from Wallace's hidden accounts, he said, leaning against the heavy mahogany. Jenkins has been talking since they put him in the interrogation room. He's trying to cut a plea deal, offering up 3 dirty county judges who were rubber-stamping his fake warrants in exchange for immunity. David looked up, dark eyes cold and unwavering. No deals. My thoughts exactly. A dangerous smile touched Callahan's lips. The Attorney General is drafting the indictments as we speak. We're going to burn this corrupt network to the bedrock, David. And we're going to make sure Jenkins serves as the ultimate cautionary tale. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Richmond was a fortress of concrete and media vans. The trial of the Commonwealth versus Bradley Jenkins had gripped the nation. It was no longer the trial of a single rogue officer. It was an indictment of an entire broken system that had allowed men with badges to act as highway pirates. Inside the packed mahogany-paneled courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Bradley Jenkins sat at the defense table. The arrogant, swaggering predator who had terrorized Route 20 was gone. In his place sat a hollow, graying man, drowning in an oversized orange prison jumpsuit, hands trembling as he stared at the polished wood of the table. His own union had abandoned him within 48 hours of the arrest. His wife had filed for divorce. He was entirely alone. The prosecution's case was an avalanche of irrefutable evidence. Toby Lawson took the stand, voice steady, and testified under oath against his former training officer, detailing the systemic racism and the brutal extortion tactics Jenkins had forced him to witness. The ledger was projected onto massive screens while financial experts traced every stolen dollar to Jenkins and Wallace. But the most devastating moment of the trial came on the 4th day when David Henderson took the witness stand. Dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, he exuded calm, unshakable authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply recounted the events of that August night with surgical precision. The prosecution played the 48-minute audio recording in open court. The jury listened in absolute, horrified silence as Jenkins's abusive, racist threats echoed off the courtroom walls, contrasting violently with David's polite, steady compliance. They heard the chilling click of the taser. They heard the terrifying moment Jenkins promised to drag David out by his lapels. When the recording ended, the lead prosecutor stepped forward. Mr. Henderson, what was going through your mind when Officer Jenkins aimed his weapon at you over a fabricated lane violation? David looked directly at the jury box. I was thinking about my daughter, he said softly. The silence in the room amplified every word. I was thinking that I had done everything right, followed the law, paid my taxes, served my Commonwealth, complied with every command, and yet, because of the color of my skin and the badge on his chest, none of it mattered. I was thinking that if I made one sudden movement, I would become another tragic hashtag on the morning news. He then slowly turned his gaze to the defense table and locked eyes with Jenkins. But mostly, David continued, voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, I was thinking about how many innocent people who did not have the governor on speed dial had sat exactly where I was sitting. How many lives this man had destroyed for his own amusement and profit. And I decided, in that moment, that he was never going to wear a badge again. Jenkins physically shrank in his chair and dropped his head into his hands. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on all 42 counts, including aggravated assault, armed robbery under color of law, and multiple federal civil rights violations. Federal Judge Patricia Harmon, a no-nonsense jurist known for harsh sentencing, looked down at Jenkins with absolute contempt. "Bradley Jenkins," she stated, voice ringing like a bell of doom. "You were entrusted with a sacred duty to protect and serve. Instead, you acted as a coward, a racist, and a thief. You used the power of the state to hunt the very citizens paying your salary. It is the sentence of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a period of 25 years without the possibility of parole." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Jenkins's knees buckled. U.S. Marshals had to hold him up as they shackled his wrists and ankles and dragged him from the courtroom. The predator was finally, permanently caged. 2 weeks later, the sun shone brightly over the steps of the Virginia state capitol. Governor Robert Callahan stood at a podium surrounded by state legislators, civil rights advocates, and hundreds of citizens. Standing directly to his right was his chief of staff, David Henderson. "Today we do more than simply punish the guilty," Callahan boomed into the microphones, voice echoing across the Grand Plaza. "Today we tear up the roots of the corruption that allowed them to thrive." With a swift, decisive stroke of his pen, Callahan signed the Henderson Accountability Act into law, the most aggressive police reform legislation in the nation's history. It abolished the civil asset forfeiture loopholes Jenkins had exploited, mandated independent state audits of all county traffic stop data, and removed qualified immunity for any officer found guilty of racially profiling citizens. The crowd erupted into deafening applause. David looked out at the sea of faces and felt a profound sense of closure wash over him. The nightmare on Route 20 had not been in vain. Later that evening, long after the press had gone home and the Capitol had quieted, David Henderson walked out to the parking garage. He slid into the driver's seat of his charcoal gray Audi A8. The leather felt familiar and comforting. He started the engine. The quiet hum was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past 6 months. He drove out of the city limits and eventually turned onto the dark, winding stretch of Route 20. He passed mile marker 42. He passed the exact gravel shoulder where he had been held at gunpoint. The road was empty. There were no flashing red and blue lights hiding in the shadows. There were no predators waiting in the dark. David smiled slightly and turned up the radio. He pressed his foot on the accelerator and glided smoothly through the pines, driving home in peace. The road finally belonged to everyone. This true account of courage and consequence proves that unchecked power eventually collides with an immovable force. David Henderson's steady resolve and Governor Callahan's decisive action dismantled a corrupt, racist system that had preyed on innocent drivers for years. Justice was not merely served. It was fundamentally rebuilt so that no one else would ever have to face the same darkness alone.